Ladies and gentlemen, you're all very welcome to the Seven Oaks Hotel here this evening for the November lecture from Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society. This evening's lecture, really the lecturer needs no introduction. He's well known to you all. He's a stalwart here of the society, and he has just achieved his Masters in Regional History from St Patrick's College here in Carlow, and we congratulate him on that. As I said, he's a stalwart of the society. He is the editor of Carlow and I'll maybe say a little bit more about that later on, but he does Trojan work, and we're really indebted to him for all he does. This evening's lecture, as you can see, is The Judge and the Serial Killer, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing it, because I absolutely know nothing about it, so John, it'll be all new to us. As the night is rather dodgy outside, we'll get on with proceedings, but thank you all for coming along this evening to hear this lecture on a very cold night. So without further ado, I introduce John Kelly.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Oh, no, it's going to be. Hello. Sorry, no. No, I'll take that. The other one. Yeah, that's okay. Sorry about that. Thanks everybody for coming out on such a cold and miserable night, but I suppose it's a cold and miserable subject we're going to talk about tonight as well. So you're all very welcome. I don't know how long this is going to take or how short it's going to take, but we'll get going at it anyway. Sometimes serendipity brings you to places you never thought you'd be. This story started off with an interest in the Jackson collection, which led me then to the writings of Michael Brophy, and from there with the events that we're going to look at today. Michael Brophy had carried out a report on the contents of the Jackson collection for the Urban District Council. And from this, I took an interest in some of his writings and reading his writings from the Nationalist. But my interest was really piqued when I read a letter to the Nationalist dated Sunday the 1st of December 1888. Remember that date, 1888, from a Limerick-based Carlovian named Martin Morris. Martin Morris was an architect who was based mostly in Limerick and very involved in the centenary of 1798. But Morris was critiquing Brophy's recently published book, Carlow, Past and Present. And you can see it here. So that's Brophy there. He was an ex-RIC officer, sergeant, I think. And this is the cover of his book, Carlow, Past and Present. And Morris's letter, of course, this is the 1800s. His letter is littered with over-elaborate prose and whimsy and typical of the educated middle class of that time, and with Greek and Roman references as part of his work. But in starting the critique of the book, Morris makes a comment referring to the book's cover photo, which is here, of Wellington Bridge and the River Barrow. And he says, a lurid flash from Milton's sulphurous lake stirred the tall Arctic pine of the foul fiend. And he went on after that, then, to talk about this. In the 4th decade of this century, there lived in Castle Hill, Carlow, not far from the bridge, a monster who in the number and class of his victims rivaled the inhuman demon who recently butchered the horrified and modern city on the plain watered by the Thames, and who after years of suspected but undetected crime was seen to carry at night a heavy load wrapped in an old cloth and cast it into the river at the Carlow end of the bridge. Now, what are we talking about there? What's he alluding to there? The city of the plain, watered by the Thames. What year did I tell you to think about? What happened in 1888 in Whitechapel? Jack the Ripper, exactly. So there's sort of a, I suppose maybe a mental connection on it, but it's just very interesting, I think, the fact. But when I looked at that, and when I went back 40 years, I found these this story. So that's where we're going from. He continued anyway. The bodies of some other women who had been missing for some time were subsequently found. I saw two of the exhumed that were accidentally discovered. One in the yard at the rear of his house, and the other in waste ground where manure was deposited, between the castle and the river, near the bridge. I knew the murderer well. He was a quiet and inoffensive man, but not when maddened by drink. So that this outrage and this person had not really entered social memory in Carlow town is really puzzling, because it was a media sensation at the time. Extensive reportage in newspapers. Reports were published in the Carlow Morning Post, the Carlow Standard, the Kilkenny Journal. Around Ireland, the Kerry Evening Post, the Clonmel Herald, Tipperary Free Press, the Ballyshannon Herald, Dublin Morning Register, Dublin Evening Mail, Freeman's Journal, and even across the water, Shute's Western Herald, the Reading Mercury, the Hull Packet and East Riding Times, the St. James Chronicle. So this talk will examine the different aspects of this affair and the people who were involved and who were affected by the events. But before examining the specific details related to the murders, an overview of social conditions and tensions which were extant in the town would provide very useful background to this. So we're going to start with that. So we're looking here at Carlow in the 18th century. So when we're considering Carlow town in this period, it's impossible not to take into account the social and political effects of the total defeat of the rising of the United Irishmen in the county in 1798 and the subsequent executions, tortures and transportations. We can have no understanding of the impact of that slaughter on the psyche of the Catholics of Carlow. Their whole world must have been turned upside down. Conversely, the local loyal Carlovians, loyal I mean Unionists, must have felt triumphal. The rising was suppressed, the Union had been secured, and the Orange Order was very strong in Carlow, particularly with members like Robert Cornwall, John Staunton and Rochford having been particularly prominent in 1798. Padraig Snoddy, in his work, identified 10 Orange Lodges in Carlow in the early 19th century, and in the period between 1825 and 1828, even when the order was suppressed under the Unlawful Societies Act, they were replaced by the Brunswick Clubs. And the Carlow Brunswick Club was formed on the 6th of January 1829, and it met in the courthouse. The press were not allowed to come to the meeting, but an intrepid reporter from the Carlow Morning Post was initially refused admittance, but he eventually gave a slip when the porter turned his back on him, and he attended the whole farrago. However, though, the early days of the Union must have involved a level of nervousness in loyal quarters. Some of the insurgents still remained at large for a number of years, notably Michael Dwyer in Wicklow, who was captured in 1803 or surrendered, and the band led by James Corcoran in South Carlow, Wexford, which remained at large till 1804. This post-1798 nervousness is illustrated in an 1804 case involving 4 Carlow men. They were named Murphy, Moran, Kinsella, and an unnamed innkeeper, who were accused of being intimately connected with the immediate expectation of French assistance. The London Morning Post newspaper reported they were expected to be detained in the same manner as the 1798 state prisoners and be held without trial for a considerable time while other arrests were expected. The newspaper also reprinted a letter from Carlow which reported that a box of pike heads had been uncovered near the turnpike in Loughlin Bridge. Rumours of a number of meetings in the area resulted in the dispatch of dragoons, but no one was apprehended. However, reports of pike making and arms caches continued for a number of years, up to the 1820s, to do with that, and there was frequent panics over that. But an early visitor to Carlow after the rebellion was John Lee, who visited in 1806, and Lee noted that a new-looking building just on the one side of Tulla Street, wonder was that maybe Lowry's Lane, was rebuilt at that stage, don't know. On his arrival, though, Lee was solicited by a poor boy from the county of Tipperary who was travelling for learning. The boy asserted that many boys go about the country in the same manner. And the issue of begging was also noted by Reverend James Hall in 1821, who was surrounded by beggars wallowing in filth and rags, soliciting charity. But interestingly, the beggars pleaded to both the Blessed Virgin and St. George, maximising the potential to collect charity from both sides of the confessional rift. But even in the 1820s, the town was still in poor condition. The Carlow Morning Post complained of heaps of dungs gathering in the different streets and lanes, and the streets were inundated by strange beggars. As a town with a constant cavalry complement of 100 troops, Carlow could expect to experience the social activities which accompany military installations, most frequently alcohol and prostitution. And the latter vice was the subject of a complaint printed in the Carlow Morning Post of the 31st of January 1828, and that he directed the attention of the magistracy and the local constabulary to the groups of night walkers of both sexes, but particularly depraved women who infested streets in every part of this town. Prolificacy, obscenity and vice, in language most shocking and conduct most infamous, seem to have obtained the license to insult and disgust the virtuous, and to banish the comfort which the loss of business and the evening relaxation from toil should naturally bring to the family fireside. So, the very air might be called polluted by the breath of the wretches of the most debauched, so that in the twilight hour, the modest and well-conducted of all ranks of inhabitants were frequently, if not constantly, compelled to immure themselves in the most retired part of their dwellings as the only security against the shrieks, profanities, blasphemies that invaded the ears of delicacy and virtue. We shall not cease to denounce this nuisance until it's abated. So there obviously was a lot of work at night going on in Carlow at that time. But also at this time, modern policing was very much in its infancy, and previous attempts to establish an efficient police force, such as the baronial constabulary, which were controlled by the local grand juries, were described as being so inefficient as to be generally worthless. In 1813, the Peace Preservation Force was established, which was controlled by Dublin Castle, and was generally used as a type of a flying squad to rush into areas where there were riots and things like that going on, and they would suppress them. But it was the creation of the Irish County Constabulary by the Constabulary Act of 1822, which ensured the county would have a force with the training and resources to keep the peace. Described as a denominationally inclusive county constabulary, this force, going through different guises, would police Ireland until 1922. In Carlow, on the 4th of November 1822, the magistrates of the county met, chaired by Colonel John Staunton Rochford, who suggested that Carlow should receive the smallest possible of police that may be supposed necessary. But after consultation with Major James Tandy, who superintended County Dublin, Carlow, Wicklow and Kildare, the meeting agreed that the county would have 60 constables and 3 high constables. And at a meeting on the 10th of December that year, the number of constables was increased to 72. So obviously Staunton must have thought that some money would be coming out of the landlord's boxes, money, but they got around it anyway. Carlow Town would be the headquarters of the force and where the resident chief constable would be located. Borris and Tullow would also have chief constables. Murder was not uncommon in the 19th century. And in 1830, the whole county was gripped by a sensational murder in the south of the county. Sorry, On the 29th of January, magistrates H.H. Watson and T. Watson charged William Stiles and Catherine Smith of the murder of Nathaniel Smith, Catherine's husband, and John Stiles as an accessory. In February, the Times reported that Smith had been found by neighbours at the Croppy Gap on his back and seemingly lifeless. His skull was deeply fractured in 2 places. Stones had been placed on his body to hold him down. However, neighbours found him and brought him home, and while he was badly injured, unluckily for his wife Catherine, he was able to speak and claimed his wife had ill-used him. Smith died while waiting for a clergyman to attend him, and an inquest was convened for the following day. William Stiles admitted culpability in the murder at the instigation of Catherine. Having rejected shooting, they'd lured Nathaniel out at night to look after the sheep when William attacked him with a pitchfork and gave Nathaniel several blows to the head. He then covered him with stones. William also claimed that when the person who went for the clergyman was absent, Catherine finished the work of the destruction on the 24th of January, first poisoning him with a mixture of tobacco, corrosive sublimate, and turpentine, and failing that, she then smothered him with her handkerchief. It must have been a big handkerchief. Both parties were sent to Carlow jail for a trial. Stiles and his brother, though, turned against Catherine and portrayed her as a femme fatale. Both brothers gave evidence of Catherine's promise to marry William and give him her property. Catherine was convicted and sentenced to death. But as she was pregnant by William, a jury of matrons recommended that the execution be postponed until the child was born. Tragic postscript: Catherine delivered her child in jail, but as she was recovering from puerperal fever, she noticed works in the jail. On inquiry, she discovered it was her scaffold being erected. She swooned away under the strong terrors of her awful fate. Since this shock, she declined rapidly, and on Friday night she died. Poor old Catherine, she really got the bad end of it. So that's, I suppose, one of the murders. There's lots of them, if you look at them, and some very interesting ones. We're going to look now at the sort of trouble spots. And the big trouble spot in Carlow in this period was the river crossing at Greig Bridge and the Greig Fair, which took place on January the 6th, February the 18th, April the 1st, and October the 6th. Here we meet Lord Norbury as well. Commenting on these troubles in a charge to the Carlow Grand Jury in 1823, Chief Justice Norbury identified the lack of jurisdiction over the west side of the River Barrow as a major problem. And he claimed that ruffians came nightly from Greig in the Queen's County and, having committed outrages, thefts, larceny, ran away and laughed at those magistrates whose jurisdiction did not extend to them. They had a very good job going on there. Another manifestation of trouble across the river was in 1826 when labourers seeking work on the harvest had crowded around the market crossing Carlow. In this instance, labourers from the village of Greig and from the country. Now the Greig guys were called Greigites. Never heard that before till I looked at this. And the country people were called clodhoppers. So they gathered to get a few days' work, but an argument started when it became known that the clodhoppers had agreed a rate that the Greig lads didn't like, and they found it unacceptable. It says then, sickles were bandied, and the Greigites seemed to have been well prepared as they took their stand on a heap of stones that lay in Castle Street. So the heap of stones, I say, didn't come out of the sky. Sergeant Valentine's a very famous sergeant in the RIC in Carlow. He's wrote a book on his own. Really, really funny guy. Loads of stories about him. A very upright person as well. And Sergeant Valentine of the Carlow Police and a number of constables were injured. But after the police regrouped, they were issued with firearms and bayonet, and the mob quickly dispersed at that stage. Another danger relating to the river was the ever-present threat of robbery of valuable cargo on the river, with the allied threat to their crews. 5 men were brought before Lord Norbury in Carlow Assizes on the 26th of March 1822, indicted variously with conspiracy to murder, grand larceny, righteous assembly, affray, assault, all pleaded not guilty. The court heard how Henry Walker, who was in charge of boat number 610 on the Barrow navigation, suffered an attack that appears to have had its roots in a dispute about recruitment, which was exacerbated by the partisan animosity between the boat workers from Graignamanagh, Loughlin and Carlow. John Brennan, Pat Stapleton, Maurice Curran boarded the boat and attacked Walker and his 2 helpers. Austin and Daniel Walker were subject to a bad beating by Brennan, being beaten by tongs and suffering over 20 cuts on his hands and arms. Lord Norbury, hearing the case, recommended the jury found the accused to be guilty of affray and riot. Concerning the capital charge against Brennan and Curran, and here we can see Norbury's true colours, he interpreted their threats to kill as the phraseology of the lower orders, and that it was common to hear them say, "I was murdered, he murdered me all night, he killed me outright." The jury found as directed by the judge, and Patrick Stapleton and John Brennan were sentenced to 12 months imprisonment, with the other 6 getting 6 months each. Interestingly, a Michael Kavanagh, who was a character witness in this, and John Brennan may also be connected with the awful offence we'll talk about later on. And we're going to actually meet this person now. John Byrne is his name. John Byrne, he could have lived out his life in obscurity and anonymity, but for a series of events which occurred between 1825 and 31, which propelled him into almost every newspaper in Ireland and Britain. Outside his phrase of notoriety, very little is known about him. From newspaper reports, we know he was a shoemaker or a shopkeeper, that he served in the military, and he lived at the bottom of Castle Hill, or Skinner's Row, where he also had a shop. We can't find any genealogical evidence that really would trace his family, but a mob is recorded as calling him variously the Blind Byrne, the Black Huckster, or the Black Huckster's son. The issue of payment of tolls was a cause célèbre which the Carlow Morning Post condemned as a system of plunder against the poor and industrious. In March of that year, a dispute about the collection of the tolls on Wellington Bridge broke into a full-scale riot. Dick Byrne, Deputy Collector of Customs, had challenged a collier who refused to pay the 3p toll. A fight broke out. Mrs. Byrne joined in, support her husband. The collier's friends joined in then. Byrne Jr. joined in, and the battle raged. Shillelaghs, hats, caps, and wigs flew about. The local magistrate, Robert Jackson, assisted by the police, eventually locked up Byrne Sr. for the night. He was described in the newspaper as being full of the spirits of this occasion. Interestingly, the list of the Carlow Regiment of Militia in March 1816 has an R. Byrne named as a lieutenant. It's possible, I suppose, that the toll collector would have been an ex-soldier, would have been an ideal person to actually do the collections, that would have been trusted. John Byrne, the shoemaker who we're talking about, owned a shop in the same vicinity, and considering his pugnacity, as well as the obvious illusion of intoxication, both characteristics portrayed by John and by Byrne, we'll see later on, it could possibly that Dick's son was actually John the shoemaker. And here's the man himself, Lord Justice, Chief Justice Lord Norbury. On the 12th of January 1825, the Waterford Mail reported from the fair in Graig on Thursday the 6th of January had a huge attendance, more numerous than any other fair since it was established. As always, the fair was attended with drinking, fighting, and all other aspects of antisocial behaviour. In this maelstrom, John Byrne stabbed Thomas Brennan from Great Collection between the first and second rib, perforating his lungs. Brennan was conveyed to the county hospital, as was Father Rafter, who was seriously injured in the affray but survived. However, Brennan died on the 16th of January, and an inquest took place on the following day before the magistrates William Fishburne and Henry Waters. After hearing witnesses, the jury found that John Brennan came to his death in consequence of a wound received from John Byrne on the night of the 16th instance. On the 11th of March, Byrne was brought before Lord Norbury, Justice of the Common Pleas at the Carlow Assizes for murder. Just a little bit about Lord Norbury, or John Toller. John Toller, Earl of Norbury, was one of the most controversial and interesting figures in 18th and 19th century Ireland. He was a politician, he was a lawyer. He went on to have a very long and contentious life as a judge, retiring in 1827, almost 90 years old. Following his admission to the bar in 1770, his public life commenced, starting from the position of chairman of the Dublin Quarter Sessions, which were particularly noted as a very bloody court compared to, say, with the city court. He steadily rose through the ranks from 3rd Sergeant to 2nd Sergeant to Solicitor General in 1789, Attorney General in 1798. Very controversial that the Attorney General would actually act as judge. It wasn't a done thing. You're compromising yourself. And then Chief Justice of the Common Pleas from 1800 to 1827. So very well known man, avowedly pro-union. His appointment to the post of Chief Justice was commonly thought to be a reward for his support for the Act of Union and his involvement in the Commission trials following 1798 rebellion. He's largely remembered for his anecdotes. He's sort of seen as a sort of a buffoon, but he was a very deadly buffoon, both in court and in person as well. As Chief Justice, he would have got the plum jobs, and the plum job was not to go too far from Dublin. So he was what was called the Leinster, or the home circuit he did on. So he would have been dealing with Kilkenny, Carlow, Athy, all down the east coast. But he had very strong Carlow connections, as his daughter, Letitia, had married William Brown of Browns Hill, and Norbury was a frequent house guest there. So we go back to Brennan's case. So the case against Brennan opened with evidence from the surgeon, Henry Collis Carter, who reported that Brennan was aware he was dying when he was in the infirmary and claimed that he had been murdered by Byrne, the black huckster's son. Norbury accepted Brennan's conversation with Carter as a dying declaration, so it was entered in evidence. Norbury could be both playful and very pompous, and on this day he was in a bad form. And a late arriving lawyer named Barrett encountered the latter side and was chastised and been told that he was not of importance enough to interrupt the solemn proceedings in a court of justice, and that his rude approach was monstrous. So, a lot of pomposity there, all right. John Ryan, who was a witness in this case, had a shop in Castlehill and knew both Byrne and Brennan. He gave evidence that he saw Byrne in a very drunk state on the 6th of January, between 7 and 8 o'clock. Brennan at this time was in his own shop. A crowd had assembled and were harassing Byrne, mockingly calling Blind Byrne and the black huckster. Ryan continued his evidence, explaining that the crowd were running to and fro from his door, and that Byrne sallied out from his own house. The mob were going up before him, and so he was running out after them. They were coming back in. It was going in and out like that. Ryan also claimed that Byrne said, "By the great God, I'll murder the stick into him." There's no dispute that there was a large mob about his house. A great multitude occupied the whole street, and at least 2 persons challenged Byrne to fight, saying, "Damn your soul, what are you afraid of?" But Norbury, looking at the evidence, summed up the evidence and noted that Byrne's house was under siege, and Byrne had to climb out the window for safety. But he also accepted that Byrne was notorious and that he was a soldier and was a very irritable habits. It was at this point in the summation that Norbury really shows his partiality again, when he stated, "The mob were the assailants, and Byrne, with the gallant feelings of a soldier, resisted the aggressions of the crowd and repeatedly recoiled on him." Norbury finished by declaring his house was his castle and was bound to protect as well as any of his Majesty's fortresses. He then instructed the jury on the jurisprudence relating to manslaughter. If the gentlemen of the jury believed that he was the slayer and that it was proved at the fullest point, they could only find a verdict of manslaughter. But if he had taken a life in defence of his own house and the lady within its view, they must find a verdict of justifiable homicide. Bringing off obvious pressure for acquittal, Norbury finished by stating he would leave it to the jury to say whether anything could justify such an aggression in a populous town like this. They ought not to allow a mob to aggress and then seek the ruin of a man they would injure. Unsurprisingly, the jury acquitted Byrne. However, Norbury was not finished with Byrne that day. He was also indicted by the Carlow Grand Jury on the charge of common assault of John Wilson. Wilson had been stabbed and struck on a number of occasions. He was able to produce his clothes, which showed a number of knife rents in his shirt. A reporter from the Dublin Evening Post described the event as an attack of unparalleled in the history of outrage. Norbury, using his usual twisted logic when dealing with cases involving persons of loyal inclinations, told the court he didn't regret Byrne's previous acquittal, but that he rejoiced that a man of his description was rendered amenable to the laws and not allowed to triumph in his brutal ferocity. He also alluded to the fact that Byrne was lucky he wasn't charged as a capital offence, and he was glad that a gallant soldier of Waterloo had escaped the noose. Interestingly, there in the newspaper, there's a little note under it that says he was never in Waterloo. Strangely, Norbury then passed a very high compliment to Byrne's wife, which wasn't recorded, but he did say that he hoped her influence and advice had no doubt would prevent future violence. Byrne was convicted and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. So he got away with the killing and he got 2 years imprisonment. I think this case illustrates the influence that could be brought to bear on trials by partisan judges. Norbury referred to Byrne as the bully of the town, which implies he already had a poor reputation. Norbury also commented on the leniency of the charge brought before Byrne for the assault on Wilson, but it seems in both cases loyalty trumped justice. We're now entering, I suppose, where a sort of between the killing of Brennan and the big outbreak. So the Limerick Chronicle reported that John Byrne was in Tullow on the 17th of October 1827, was committed to Carlow jail by the magistrate Robert Dine for abusive language on the Reverend G. Dawson and with violent threats preventing him performing his duty as a clergyman at a funeral of a parishioner. This seems to be a reoccurring thing with Byrne, because in the 31st of March 1828 he again reported as preventing a clergyman in his duty and given 1 week's confinement. Both of these events were likely to have been involved with Byrne and his previous antipathy, say, towards the Father Rafter as well. So obviously he wasn't very happy with clerics on either side. In April 1829, an assault on Greig Bridge, very similar to some of the ones that were previously done before, took place when a man named Nolan was assaulted while returning from Greig Fair. There's Greig Fair again. A woman who asked Nolan to intervene in a fight, to intervene and prevent murder. Nolan intervened and the ruffian turned on Nolan, took an iron bar that Nolan had thrown away and left Nolan with a fractured skull, which later required trepanning, which I never heard of in Ireland, and the following day he was in the county infirmary. In August 1829, the Drogheda Journal reported Byrne was convicted for trespass at the Carlow Assizes and was sentenced to 1 day's imprisonment and further until he could provide personal security of £10 personally and £5 to others. So we're getting to the meat of the story now. How are we for time? God, it's flying. 1831, a very interesting year for Carlovians. In March, John Byrne appeared in court for stealing a pig and was sentenced to 2 months imprisonment for hard labour. Readers of the Carlow Morning Post were enjoying the embarrassment of Beauchamp Colclough in the Carlow Petty Sections, where Margaret Long was claiming that her 2 chubby rose-check boys were perfectly finished portraits of Mr. Colclough as was ever exhibited. And then Thomas Cobden's Roman Catholic Cathedral was just being finished in Carlow and was said to be a lasting memorial to JKL's zeal and influence, as well as the piety and liberality of the people of Carlow. Just before Christmas, on the 19th of December, the Carlow Morning Post was editorialising and complaining about the Squireens and the Shawneens who patronised the Carlow Standard. This was the Protestant pro-union newspaper, which didn't last for very long, was edited by John Ryan, who would later write the history of antiquities of the county of Carlow in 1833. The Standard was known locally as the Oak Park Gazette due to its bias towards Henry Brune. But on the bottom of page 3 of this edition, the Carlow Morning Post, a small report on finding the body of Anne Coffey, an unfortunate female, on the Weir at Greig Bridge. Suspicion immediately fell on John Byrne, described as a shoemaker residing in Greig, and he was committed to Carlow jail. Coffey had been missing since the previous Thursday, the 15th of December, and was found on Saturday, the 8th of December. James Battersby, sub-inspector, wrote to Colonel Sir John Harvey, Inspector General of the Police, on the 19th of December, informing him that Anne Coffey was found by a boatman in the River Barrow, and her legs and arms first tied by a rope which fastened carpet bag across the entire body. He named her as Anne Coffey, and she was murdered by a man now in custody. And there's the actual original note from the Chief Secretary's office. After the corpse was retrieved from the river, it was initially moved to the police office. A jury of 12 men, with Joshua Budds as foreman, were sworn in, and the inquest was then adjourned on the following day in the Carlow Courthouse under Magistrate William Carey. In testimony on the following day, John Coffey, the deceased father, said Anne had left her house on Friday morning between 7 and 8 o'clock with a girl called Connor. On Thursday, she had gotten a letter from her husband asking her to meet him in Naas, and she borrowed £6 off Mr. Joe Fushburn. Her father said she was in the habit of drinking with Byrne, and he hadn't seen Connor since. Following witnesses provided evidence at the inquest. Patrick King, who recovered the body, confirmed the boat hook did not pierce the body. Sergeant Fleming produced the rug Coffey was wrapped in and the bloody blanket found in Byrne's house. Sergeant Potter stated the immediate cause of death was strangulation and there was a deep cut in the base of the skull caused by a sharp instrument, possibly a knife. Matthew Murphy, Byrne's apprentice, didn't understand the nature of an oath, but he saw a rug like the one that was shown in Byrne's house. Thomas O'Neill, who was on trial with Byrne, said he saw the rug 3 weeks before in Byrne's. He first saw Coffey in Byrne's for the first time 3 weeks previously. On that Friday, Thomas Roach was going down Corcoran's Lane where he saw a man at the wall standing over a bulky object. When he approached the man, his hat was knocked off, and as he fled, he fell a number of times and was hit with a stone. Edward Bryan, Roach's landlord, ventured to see what was happening and identified John Byrne, stating it was Byrne that stabbed the man. Byrne shortly afterward came to Bryan's house and forced Roach to go to Mrs. Pender's for a drink. Byrne asked to sleep with him, but Roach refused. He stated that Byrne was tipsy at the time. James Rourke was making a pail in McDonald's workshop on Friday morning when he heard two female shrieks coming from Byrne's house. A boy in the workshop said it must have been Coffey as she was living with Byrne. Sergeant Valentine, here he is again, produced a packet that he found in Byrne's house and a cloak and a petticoat which was pawned in Byrne's name. These were identified as Coffey's by Mary Crowe and Judy Doyle. Evidence was also given of the items that were pawned by a lady called Murphy for 2 shillings and 6pence. Byrne was identified by James Dillon as the man with the pawn ticket. Final witness, Michael Kavanagh, described in the Carlow Morning Post as a man of very bad character who was often seen in Byrne's company. On Sunday, Kavanagh was passing Byrne's door when Byrne asked what the commotion was about. Kavanagh replied, people were going to the river to see Anne Coffey's remains being taken from the barrow. Byrne nonchalantly replied, is that all? To which Kavanagh says, are you not afraid? The juror then interrupted and asked Kavanagh that question. After some confusion on Kavanagh's part, he finally replied Byrne was in the habit of keeping company with the deceased. The jury retired, this is the inquest jury, and came back with the verdict that Anne Coffey came to her death by willful murder, and we were of the opinion that the said murder was committed by John Byrne. After the inquest, Byrne remained under arrest and was held in Carlow jail pending his trial. He asked his brother to lock his house so he would be ready for resuming business when released and seemed in good spirits. He must have thought that he had a good chance of getting away. However, on Wednesday morning, 21st of December, he was found hanging from a bar in his cell, having used his sheets to fashion a rope. He complained at 4 a.m. to the adjacent inmate that the noise of the rats were keeping him awake. But authorities later thought that he used that as that the death throes when he was scratching. That's why he said that. There'll be no sensational court case to tantalise the readers of the Carlow Morning Post, but neither would be justice for the family of Anne Coffey. In fact, at least 2 more families would soon be mourning. Byrne's inquest took place on the 22nd of December under magistrates Colonel Bruin, William Carey, Samuel Elliott, and Henry Waters. The jury was led by Surgeon James Porter as foreman. The first question was the jail turnkey Robert Humphreys, who said Byrne was cheerful and well. He last saw him between 4 and 5 o'clock on Wednesday and found him suspended at the window the following morning. MacDonald, the prison governor, spoke to Byrne about 4 p.m. on Wednesday and said he was quite composed, with MacDonald not detecting an apprehension of deceased committing suicide. Byrne also said he hoped he would appear at his trial because he was innocent. However, Byrne was perhaps foreboding a more morbid result when he asked that his furniture be given to his sister-in-law and Greg. Dr. Byrne, after examining the body, gave the cause of death as ligature caused death by suffocation. The jury immediately pronounced the verdict of death in consequence of having suspended himself from the iron bars of the cell. Freeman's Journal commented on both deaths, stating that the habitual and immoderate use of ardent spirits appears to be the mainspring of this series of crimes, of which there is no parallel, and I'd be inclined to agree with him. While there's more than a little hyperbole in this claim, it is clear from the incidents of 1831, and from Byrne's previous delinquencies and predilection to violence, that alcohol played a major part in his transgressions. The report also describes other offences which were previously unspoken, but would now be discussed more freely as the monster had died. Specifically, Byrne was thought to have been the cause of death of his wife, to be instrumental in the death of his mother. It also references a sentence for transportation handed out for killing on Greig Bridge, but that he escaped sentence by converting to Protestantism. On the 29th of December in the courthouse was full to overflowing and expected Michael Kavanagh, who was charged as accessory of Byrne. However, Kavanagh never made an appearance, much to the chagrin of the throngs that attended. 1 month later, the putrefying body of Anne Connors was taken to River Barrow on the 27th of January. Unlike Coffey, her body was not caught on the weir and was found at Clyde, just 3 miles from Carlow. The body was tied up in a similar manner to Coffey, and due to the advanced decomposition of the remains, the magistrates ordered the body to be immediately buried without an inquest. A fortnight later, 12th of February, workmen in the house adjacent to Byrne's discovered in an outhouse the remains of a woman which had been decomposed to a skeletal state. The corpse was identified by address and identified as belonging to Betty Gannon, who was reported missing in June 1831. Newspapers fell silent then. No more about it. It was like it never happened. But the killings were still in some people's minds. Freeman's Journal in 1836 reported on an editorial in the London Standard which accused Daniel O'Connell of having adverse opinions on the chastity of the lower classes of the English women. The Standard responded to this alleged slander and accused the Irishmen of being the greatest slayers of women in the world. After noting that such a calumny on the Irish, which was neither noticed nor commented on by foreign or British visitors, the Freeman Journal then had to admit that Ireland had its share of barbarians and referred to the loss of female life which would take place in certain tracts of Carlow. Gaps in the runs of newspapers for this period, lack of access to relevant papers in private hands, and of course the disaster in the forecourts all combined to stymie a comprehensive narrative of this case. In particularly the Carlow Morning Post, which there's a gap I think between 1823 and 1827, which is probably the key part in finding out what ticked off Byrne, what started them off. And then given that Catholic burials were generally not recorded in parish records and civil registrations only commenced in 1864, really means that any identification of individuals or their relationships will always be of a tentative nature. Michael Kavanagh, who was implicated in at least Coffey's death, disappears from the papers almost immediately. The only reference to a Michael Kavanagh I can find after that would fit his profile would be a Michael Kavanagh who was transported to Australia in 1838 aboard the Westmoreland. There are many unanswered and unanswerable questions in this case, but the most pertinent ones, I think, are: why was the crowd besieging Byrne's house? Why was Byrne seemingly treated leniently on a number of occasions? And what caused Byrne's outburst, where he actually went on the spree? So if we think about the attack on the house, well, if Byrne was previously in the military and he was son of a toll collector, there may be strong nationalist feelings which made him and his property a target for abuse, particularly if he was frequently inebriated and violent. Inebriation, when he was drunk, he would be an easy target for the amusement of the drunken throng. That was Tommy Cooper one. Niamh Howland, noting the local nature of many disputes and close relationships between the accused and the prevalence for disputes to be settled between masters using parallel systems of rough justice or inflicting retribution on the community, would fit this. John Brennan, who was sentenced for 2 years imprisonment for the boat attack may well have been related to Thomas Brennan, who was one of the challengers to fight Byrne in 1825. That might have been what kicked off that day. Another connection was, of course, is the Michael Kavanagh connection. But alternatively, the thing might just have been just a drunken brawl, and just an example of what would have happened sometimes. Was Byrne treated leniently by the courts? Well, Norbury was always seen as a hanging judge. He was notoriously partisan when it came to matters relating to the Union and the primacy of loyalism and Protestantism. Norbury was legendary for being able to twist evidence and jurisprudence when it came to cases involving soldiers and the enforcement of law. The most absurd example of this is in 1797, where Lieutenant Simon Fraser of the Fraser Fencibles at a Thai Assizes, and where Norbury was Solicitor General, took this position, talking about a guy called Dixon who was killed by either Fraser or Fraser's Batman. It's not obvious. Norbury says, if Dixon was as good a man as those witnesses have represented him to be, why it is deduced fortunate for him to be out of this wicked world. But if, on the contrary, his political bias was as bad as many others in the neighbourhood, it is undoubtedly well for the country to be rid of him. So if he was good, he should have gone straight to heaven, and if he was bad, well, we got rid of him. Norbury's charge to the jury included the man's home and his castle rationale, and he advised the jury to acquit, which the jury did. I suppose finally we're looking at the killing of Coffey, Connors and Gannon, and the allusions to the murder of his mother, his wife, an unnamed man in Great Bridge, and all the others. No other suspect was put forward. Kavanagh and O'Neill were arrested, but seemingly disappeared from the narrative. So they obviously weren't jailed. And the newspapers and the police were sure of Byrne's guilt. Martin Morris, go back to him for the very start again, 40 years later, still recalled the finding of one of the victims, probably Gannon. Alec Burns, in Carlow, 1984-85, said that around this area lived a black codister who was reputed to have murdered several people before being brought to justice and hanged for his crimes. Well, Alec got a little bit of it wrong, but most of it right. Just before I finish then, a few other possible threads. A number of crimes have been you could attribute maybe to Byrne as well. Speculative account from Dublin, where a clever rogue called John Byrne, in the company of a woman, passed a counterfeit shilling in Davis's public house on George's Quay in Dublin. This Byrne knocked down 4 of the watchmen and left marks of displeasure in the others, in the form of black eyes and cut heads. So it certainly sounds like Byrne. Byrne had somehow disposed of all the counterfeit coins he had before arriving at College Street Watch House, and the charges were dismissed. What's interesting is, in the early 1830s, there was a lot of counterfeiting going on in Carlow as well. So there was that's interesting. Another John Byrne was in 1828, on 26th of December in Callan. There was a man named Nicholas Ryan was murdered in a violent brawl. Byrne was brought to Kilkenny Assizes on the 12th of August and was charged with aiding and assisting at the murder, but was acquitted, as the only evidence against him was a woman of very bad character. So how mobile were people at that time, I don't know. So possibly not. Lots of Byrnes around the country. This one is definitely not John Byrne, but this is a really interesting one. It's a John Byrne from Carlow, but I think it was from Clonmore. And it was subject of a commission case in Dublin, where John Byrne accused George Maguire of stealing jewellery and 111 gold sovereigns. The sovereigns claim was dropped, but Byrne and Maguire had lived in Paris, where Byrne from Clonmore was looking after a Reverend Matthew Kelly. After Kelly's death, Byrne, not wanting to hand over Kelly's considerable fortune to the Parisian College, gave it to Maguire for safekeeping, and that was when hasn't been seen since. Thank you very much.